Hey guys, it's Libby, and today I'm going to be recommending some literary fiction for people who don't like literary fiction based on the genres that they do like. Catchy title, I know. I've always found it difficult to describe what kinds of books that I like because I'm not really into any specific genres, even literary fiction. What I like is stuff that's sort of right on the border in the murky gray area where genre fiction fades into literary fiction. So I like highly literary genre fiction and genre-influenced literary fiction. So for example, I've got two of my favorite books here. One of them is Under the Skin by Michel Faber, which is undeniably science fiction. There is an alien spacecraft that touches down in the middle of Scotland, but it's actually not even marked as science fiction. It's marked as just regular fiction because of the literary style that it's written in. And then Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, I think, is quite clearly literary fiction, but it takes a lot of influence from horror and suspense novels. So my first recommendation is for science fiction fans, and I chose God Help the Child by Toni Morrison. This is set in the present day. It's about a young woman named Bride. We also spend some time with her when she's a child, and she has very dark skin, as distinct from the other members of her family who are light-skinned blacks. And because of this, her mother never shows her any kindness because she thinks that the world is crueler to people with dark black skin, and so she doesn't want her to get used to comforts. So we see the desperate things Bride tries to do to get her mother to love her, and we also see how all of this affects her in her adult life when we join her right after her boyfriend breaks up with her. I thought this would appeal to science fiction fans because how it explores foreignness and exploring new sort of realms, because Bride lives in the city, but during the book some stuff happens and she ends up stuck in like the middle of nowhere in the woods. And the interactions that she has with the people who she meets and the way she sort of figures out how they perceive her reminded me in some ways of a First Contact story. And there's also a small element of magical realism that turns Bride's body into a foreign place to her. So that's what I picked for sci-fi fans. Moving on to fantasy, I picked a book that I am currently rereading for like the dozenth time or something. That is The Meaning of Night by Michael Cox. This book came out about 10 years ago, but it's set in the mid-19th century, and it's about a man named Edward Gliver trying to get revenge on his once friend, now enemy, Phoebus Daunt, and this leads him to making discoveries about his own past. So I thought this would be good for fantasy fans because of how immersive the world is. I don't think I've ever read a book written outside of the Victorian period that has so many like delicious details about the Victorian period. So getting to know so intimately London and various other parts of England in this different time period is kind of like discovering a new world. There's also, since this is a very highly biased narrative, since it's written in the first person, some good old-fashioned like good and evil conflicts between Edward and Phoebus Daunt. My next selection is for people who enjoy romance novels. I've picked The Distant Hours by Kate Morton, although you could probably pick any book by Kate Morton. I've only read two of them, Distant Hours and The House at Riverton. This was the one that I preferred, but there is a certain similarity to the feel between all of Kate Morton's works, and so that's the first reason why I picked her to be my recommendation for romance fans, because part of the appeal of romance novels is a certain comfortableness with what you're going to get. I also thought that this would be good because it's very focused on interpersonal relationships. Romance novels, of course, are focusing on romantic relationships, but Kate Morton likes to write about parent-child relationships especially, and The Distant Hours also has interesting things to say about sibling relationships. If I had to summarize The Distant Hours in one sentence, I would say that it's about learning to see your parents as like real humans, and it also looks at what can be done today to heal things that have been done in the past. So, Distant Hours is my pick for romance fans. For fans of horror, I would like to suggest The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. This is a book about 5 teenage sisters. They have very strict parents. They're not really allowed to like go out and hang out with boys and stuff. And at the beginning of the book, one of them commits suicide, and this sort of hangs over the story for the rest of the book as their parents get more and more strict and more of the girls kill themselves. So obviously, if you like horror, you can probably handle the ickiness of this. There aren't any super graphic descriptions of violence, but there are descriptions of people committing suicide, so trigger warning. It does have this dread of knowing what is to come, and also the sort of creepiness of the parents being more restrictive, so virgin suicides I think would be good for horror fans. And then for mystery, I would like to recommend Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson. This is set in the 1950s in Washington State, and there is a bit of a whodunit murder mystery going on. So the central part of the narrative is the trial of Kabuo Miyamoto, who is accused of murdering Karl Heine. And the motive is that a decade earlier, Kabuo's family had been sort of cheated out of their land that they had been paying a mortgage on by the Heine family when they were sent to an internment camp. And then coming off of this trial scene, you get stories of people in the town during the 30s and 40s when the Japanese internment on the West Coast happened. This does take place on an island, so you've got a kind of closed setting, and all of the people sort of know each other really well. That seemed quite mystery to me. So that's the book for mystery fans. And then I have one bonus book, because this isn't really a genre of fiction, this is just a genre of writing, and that is for people who are fans of poetry. So for you guys, I would like to recommend The Translator by John Crowley. This is set in the United States in the 1960s, and it's about a young woman who goes to college to study poetry, and she gets into a very intense friendship with her poetry professor, and she basically gets a summer internship working to translate his poetry, because he's Russian, and he's originally written his poetry in Russian. And of course, translating a poem is really hard, so they need to spend a lot of time thinking about it. So it's kind of hard to pull elements out of poetry and say that this book has them, because poetry can be so many things, but it does have a lot of people thinking very hard about poetry. And also the writing, it's kind of presented in a dreamlike way, even though things are realistic. They feel like sort of maybe they couldn't be. So I think you might like that. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you found something to pique your interest, and I'll see you later.